Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Camilo Hurtado-Parrado, a research professor at SIUC who is affiliated with the Behavioral Analysis and Therapy program. His research focuses on understanding human and non-human learning and behavioral processes. He is especially concerned on how they are regulated by adverse events.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for the invitation. I'm going to try to do something very ambitious today, so bear with me. I'm trying to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to put together a summary of a lot of stuff that I've done and where things are going related to my research. For those of you who have attended my other, presentations since my arrival to SIU, so bear with me. Some new stuff will show up, okay? So just be patient. Okay, so the title that I chose is very, I don't know, I thought it's not going to be overselling, but in reality, that's probably how things are going right now. I'm interested in choice, in impulsive choice, and in particular, I just said under pressure because that's just a way to, say it in a more colloquial way. But basically, I'm interested in how organisms choose under different circumstances, and most of those circumstances, let's just call them the stressful, aversive of different words or attempts to call them. For most of us, if I ask you, you will say that most of our decisions, our choices under undesirable circumstances are perhaps not the best. And that seems to be like a kind of a general intuitive approach to it, but there has to be some research on it, and that's what I've been, one way or another, trying to pursue recently with rodents and with humans. So just a little bit of background, because I think it's going to be important, a little bit to understand how I do things and why, maybe some of the approaches and some of the things that I say, and I think it's useful just to try to preach a little bit of this, so bear with me. So I'm a behavioral analyst. I was originally trained mostly as a experimental psychologist, but behavioral analyst since I started in psychology. So behavioral analysis studies behavior for the sake of behavior. You're going to see that from my perspective, or the perspective that I follow, choice is behavior, and self-control is behavior, and impulsive responding or impulsive choice is behavior. Of course, that will have some caveats and all that, but we're interested in behavioral principles, behavioral phenomena. I want to understand behavior for the sake of it. I'm not interested in behavior, or I'm saying we as behavioral science, we're interested in behavior because it is a sign or indicates something else. We want to understand behavioral principles for the sake of them. And that sometimes is confusing. So let's see if I can show you some examples during today's presentation. And we want to apply those understandings, principles to solve social issues. So that's the reason. So this diagram kind of summarizes kind of where we are. So behavior analysis have different areas. So here we call it behavior analysis and therapy, but I think it should be probably better called applied behavior analysis. That will be, which you see is an application of fundamental principles of behavior to address socially significant behavior. And of course, there is an area of behavior analysis that is professional, entirely oriented. There are many behavior analysts that dedicate most of their time to directly work with clients and all that. And the foundation, as you see on the bottom, the foundation of all this enterprise is radical behaviorism. And of course, so many misunderstandings. I'm not going to go into any of that, but radical behaviorism, at least as a set of assumptions about behavior and about humanity and about what is behavior. And what I think is more important right now is to say that behavior from our perspective is an interaction, and it's an interaction that is built historically. I think every time that I try to think about this, we focus a lot on history, the history of the individual, history of the organism, the history of the interaction of the organism with the environment. That's our way to understand behavior. Of course, that goes into the history of reinforcement or the history of punishment or, many other specific principles. But the history of individuals transcend the present moment. It goes back to even previous generations, the species, and it goes actually future in a way in terms of culture and society. So I think we actually capture history. We value history to understand behavior a lot, of course, from an experimental perspective. My work is mostly on the left side, on the fundamental principles, on the research and what we call experimental analysis of behavior. That's mostly where I focus my interest with some back and forth between applied behavior analysis, but mostly on the left side of these areas. So experimental analysis of behavior, we want to study principles of behavior. And yes, principles of behavior, that can be debated, but let's just accept for now that there are some principles of behavior. Some of the ones that we use and we try to extend and test their generality all the time are reinforcement, punishment, avoidance, choice, generalization, all these concepts that you see in the behavioral learning textbooks. That's what we assume as principles of behavior, processes of behavior. And we pursue a lot of interest in demonstrating the generality of those principles, how reliable they are when we try to test them in different experiments, with different variables. My work, as probably you're going to see, relies heavily on replication as an approach to demonstrate that generality, and trying to demonstrate that we can reproduce effects, and that's when we get a little bit more confidence on the kind of the stability of that knowledge on the behavioral principles. That entails working with humans and with other species because of that generality need or demonstration that we're pursuing most of the time. So amongst the different research areas in experimental analysis of behavior, there's one that is called aversive control of behavior. And it is basically the interest for understanding the regulation of behavior, those interactions that I was talking about, by punishment and negative reinforcement contingencies. And I got interested in aversive control behavior. I'm not going to go into the details of how I got interested in this, but it was basically by accident. 10 or 12 years ago, I was doing my PhD, and out of certain things that were happening in the lab in which I was working, and some funding opportunities and some effects that started appearing on experiments that were not originally dedicated to aversive control, I got interested in it and I picked it up. And since then, probably early in my PhD until now, I think most of my research, one way or the other, relates to this. So aversive control, as I said, negative reinforcement and punishment, those are, basically how behavior increases in probability because of aversive consequences, So we call them fines, we call them stressful events, all those, but those events in our life with which we interact actually as consequences change the probability of our behavior, increasing as a negative reinforcement or decreasing it in the case of punishment. And that's basically what this whole area is about. What happens is that during probably the last 30 years or so in behavior analysis, there was kind of a diminishing interest on aversive control. And that's related with a lot of debates related with ethics and different things. But reality is that people stopped caring a lot about aversive control, notwithstanding that aversive control is fairly common in our lives. I mean, if you think about it, many of the things that we do are one way or the other mostly regulated by negative outcomes, like not paying fines for not doing your taxes, or not, speeding because there's probably a speeding ticket waiting for you and things like that. So it's very common, and I don't think, or those of us who have worked on aversive control, we haven't really totally accepted the idea that we know everything that we needed to know about punishment and negative reinforcement. And one of the areas that, on a review some years ago, one important researcher identified, one of the areas that interestingly was not particularly well integrated with aversive control was the area of studying self-control, or what we are going to call, like choice overall. So one of the interests that I picked up during the last years was trying to integrate the research on self-control and impulsive behavior with the research on aversive control. And that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. So you're going to see that many of the things that I'm going to be talking about intersect with these topics now with that background that I just gave you. my interests go on behavioral persistence. So yeah, I mean, we know that adversity or aversive events, or however you want to call them, we usually are interested in how people keep going, not regardless if they are facing adversity or those negative outcomes, let's say. Um, some of my interests have been also related with stereotypical behavior. There seems to be some evidence that aversive events increase the stereotypy at least in some species. So for sure that has come up. I've been interested in how people learn symbolically. That means with words and language in generally. When the consequences for what they say or the consequences for that they'll learn are negative in the case of punishment. So I've been interested on that. I've been interested in memory and a particular effect related with exercise. I mean, there has been a lot of debate about exercise and memory. You probably know that even better. But one of the interesting things about it is that memory for aversive events, remembering that something bad happened or whatever, you'll expect that exercise will help you remember that. That's one prediction. But on the other hand, you'll expect that exercise will have that positive outcome, that you will forget it or you'll probably handle different those bad experiences that you have. So there's kind of that contradictory prediction. We haven't figured it out, but that's one of the areas that I've been still interested in trying to pursue. Um, Anybody who studies aversive control, that means punishment in particular, is going to have to study somehow, or going to have to approach somehow emotion or emotional response or emotional behavior. So I've been doing some side projects in terms of how emotion regulation as a behavior itself is just another way of behaving. We behave to increase or decrease other behaviors. We do that, like when we're feeling sad, we do things to increase our emotion, positive emotion, or actually opposite. Some depressed individuals actually do things that actually increase their feelings of being depressed, and all that is behavior. So I've been interested on dealing with this, and in particular how to increase conciliation with a particular kind of behavior, social relevant behavior. Um, as I said, I'm interested in language and punishment, and in particular because one of the areas that anybody that will study aversive control will have to deal with language is how people lie. And most of what we know about lying is that very often lying is related with negative outcomes. So you don't say what you did because depending what you say, maybe there's going to be punishment for that saying. So anyway, so I have a couple experiments on that, and I'm still interested in that. And as you say, highlighted here, so I'm interested in self-control and how aversive events affect self-control. So, so overall, this research area that I'm going to be trying to cover on my research and research from other researchers is what I call impulsive and self-control behavior and how aversive contingencies affect that kind of behavior. So as I mentioned earlier, we behavior analysts assume that choice and preference and impulsive behavior and self-control behavior are behaviors, and as such, they should be sensitive to contingencies. That means reinforcement and punishment or consequences in general. And that's particularly important because when you ask people who are not familiar with these fields, they typically start thinking that self-control is something that is related with impulse. Impulse in the sense that something that comes from within and guides and motivates and all this. From our perspective, self-control and impulsive behavior are, as any other behaviors, the result of a history, and they're susceptible to be changed depending on certain consequences and certain changes in the environment. So the definitions for self-control and impulsive behavior are very simple, and these are not only from behavior analysis. I think other areas like behavioral economics and other areas have kind of followed the same logic for understanding self-control and impulsive behavior. Self-control is choice or of preference for a larger delayed reinforcer over a smaller immediate reinforcer. And that's typically, I'm going to use the LL notation for that, which means larger later. So that's the same thing for our purposes here, preference for the larger later reinforcer or reward or consequence. And impulsive behavior is the preference for a small and immediate reinforcer over a larger later. So this is always about preference amongst alternatives. And self-control and impulsive behavior require the assumption that we're all the time choosing amongst different alternatives or sources of reinforcement, which, if you think about it, that's fairly easy to accept. We're always having the option to do something or do something else. What else? That's kind of the question. So one of the first experiments that I encountered and then kind of guided a little bit of my research, and you're going to see how it has expanded based on this, was some experiments on human choice in what I'm going to be calling under pressure, but basically, more specifically, were experiments in which human participants, college students, as usual, were experiencing aversive stimulation, and they were making choices for gaining different outcomes. So what we call non-contingent aversive, in this case, was on the first experiment by Flora and colleagues in almost more than 30 years ago. They presented noise, very intense noise, very annoying noise, concurrent to be doing choices and choosing amongst different options. And basically what they found was that when people were choosing to do things larger, later, or sooner, smaller, they typically increase their impulsive responses. So the procedure was very simple, and you're going to see that I keep doing this, and I have been doing this for a while. But the procedure was very simple. So people will just choose between two options. One that will give them 10 cents. That means 10 points. I mean, for the purposes of this, each point is a cent. So people will be choosing between getting literally 10 cents on a trial or getting the impulsive, or choosing the impulsive option and getting 2 cents on a trial. And the delay for the 10 cents was 20 seconds, and the delay for the impulsive 2 cents, let's say, was only 4 seconds. So people were doing these for 30 trials, and at the end they were paid, or they are paid those number of cents. And typically there are 30 trials. In recent experiments, we're using actually more trials, and they get paid at the end. So that's the basic procedure, very simple, very intuitive. So this is what they found initially. Under quiet, that means no noise, just people choosing, imagine, between the green and the blue button, back and forth, 30 trials. So of course, people are self-controlled, and that's a fairly common finding. So people will wait for their 10 cents, and that's what you see on the bars on the right, the quiet condition on both experiments. They run 2 experiments with this. And when they were presenting that annoying, very intense noise concurrent to the task, participants couldn't do anything to turn it off. It was just running as they were doing these experiments. So they increased their preference for impulsive choice and reaching, as I'm drawing there, indifference. Indifference is basically 50% of the trials SS and 50% of the trials LL. You think about it, indifference in this context means losing a considerable amount of money. I mean, you think 30 trials, 15 trials, losing 10 cents, so that's $1.50 from a full experiment. But so that's, that was interesting. That's that. Flora and colleagues replicated that experiment 10 years later. And what they did was, instead of presenting that noise, they just asked participants to get their hand submerged in cold water. And that's what is called pressure. It's a fairly common procedure, and the same story, choosing between the green and the green and blue button, 10 cents, 2 cents, back and forth. And what they found was actually an even higher increase in impulsive preference, as you see in the last part that I'm highlighting there. And compared to the other experiments, the cold pressure is perhaps the only procedure as of those experiments that produce a more clear preference for the impulsive choice. And interestingly, when participants were getting their hand in the warm water, we just lukewarm water, just not aversive, just nice temperature water, they actually increase their preference as well. So that's interesting. They didn't discuss that much, but that's interesting. You're going to see why later. Okay. So fast forward to what we did. So we actually published this recently after lots of back and forth. But what we did was, okay, so those were interesting studies. But what if, instead of using cold water, pain-related stimulation or intense noise, which we can assume that is to a certain degree painful, or at least physically related, that's pressure in your ears when you're doing other things. What if we use images? So the plan was to replicate, and as I mentioned, many of my experiments are systematic replications. That means changing something in a procedure and trying to see what is really happening there. So it's a systematic replication of those original experiments by Flora and colleagues, but using a different kind of stimulation. Let's just call it non-pain related, symbolic. There are different ways to call it, but just images. And of course, why images? Well, because that's a kind of, we are all the time exposed to this kind of unpleasant, at least, stimulation, and we know that people will try to avoid it. So what if these stimuli will produce the same kind of effect, increasing impulsive responses? So the task was the same, the same story, the same arrangement, that this is, and what we did is we took pictures from a very well-known catalog of images, which is called the IAPS, the International Affective Picture System, and we we just found images with different, let's just call it emotional functions, so aversive, appetitive, and neutral. Those images have been very studied, and so usually they are very reliable, producing at least self-reports in participants of unpleasant feelings, and avoidance, if possible. They will escape. They will try to shut down an image if, those images that are very nasty. And most of them were about mutilation for the aversive. For appetitive, we use social interactions. We didn't use any of the other images that are available for appetitive, erotica. We just use social interactions, family, nice interactions. And for neutral, just objects. So participants did something in our experiment. So basically, they were trying to find Walden. They were just presented images, as you see there. That's one of the images that we use. And we asked them to find a piece that was missing. So they will have to scan the image, find it, and they will get extra points for each image that they were correctly matching. So that way we secure that participants were interacting with the images, because they, if they are very unpleasant, so participants may be looking somewhere else. So a way to increase the interaction with the images was paying them literally to find those hidden pieces of the image, and that way increasing interaction. So this is kind of the summary how it went. So there was a choice trial, choosing between green and blue, and then one of those trials in which participants were supposed to find the missing image. The images will vary. Some of them were nasty, some of the images were just pleasant, and so on and so forth. And this keeps going for 30 trials. We tried with men and women. Experiments before by Flora didn't test for differences or sex or gender differences, so we control for that. So what we found, that with no images, we pretty much, people again are self-controlled. That's what you see on the first bars on the left. So if there's nothing happening, no images, just choosing between green and blue, people will be preference for self-control. Fine. So far that makes sense. Then, as you see with the other bars, regardless the kind of images that we're presenting, neutral, appetitive, or aversive, participants were increasing near indifference their preference. So that was weird. That was unexpected. We have some different explanations for that. Men showed more impulsive responses than women overall. That was also a finding. So we tried different analyses. I'm not going to go into many details, but I think this is mostly an illustration of the kind of breakdown that behavioral analysts go into a lot of details in the analysis. So here you see data of 5 trial blocks, trying to see if participants were having some kind of pattern choosing throughout the experiment. There's a lot of variability, as you can see, because each data point is 5 trials. So you see, there are 30 trials, so you're going to see 6 data points, and you see it broken down by women and men. So the tendency is not clear. Like at best, during the aversive images, those are very nasty mutilations. What we see is actually a decrease as a downward arrow, a decrease in impulsive responses. So if anything, the aversive images were not really increasing impulsive responses, and if anything, the effect was decreasing throughout the blocks. So that's it. We tried different analyses. We tried to see, okay, so what happened? People did really find people matched the images, found the missing piece. So actually, some people failed. Many people failed to find the missing pieces of the images. So you see the percentage of success was not particularly high, not beyond 50%. So people were missing a lot of points during these matching tasks, trying to find the images. So one of the things that we tested was, okay, so is it been failing a lot to find those missing images. Remember, this is a metaphor of under pressure. This is missing to find those images in some way, a source of frustration or a negative emotion. Maybe that's the reason participants were increasing their impulsive choice. And nope, that doesn't seem to be the case. We try, with regressions and a couple of modeling, and no, there doesn't seem to be any prediction based on how frequently participants fail to find those images and how impulsive their choices were during the experiment. So no, nothing there. We try to test other measures of impulsive behavior. Latency has been a measure of impulsive behavior for some studies. So we wanted to see latency to choose. Remember, you have the option to choose between green and blue. So some participants actually took some time to do that, to choose. So we wanted to see if that will allow us to kind of screen participants, not differences at all across the different groups, that very consistent. Participants didn't really take too long to choose, maybe 2 seconds at best. So no, nothing there. But latencies actually predict a little bit how people will choose. So people who take a little bit more time to choose in terms of latency to respond are people who typically will choose more the self-control option. So that's the reason you see that declining trend. But of course, the effect size is small, so not that many things there. So how all these relate to previous research and all that? Well, I showed you already the experiments by Flora and colleagues. Here you see our replication, the one that I was discussing from 2023 with images, and then you see another experiment that I'm going to break down a little bit more, which is with point loss. So what you see basically is that at best, we have managed to increase impulsive choice towards indifference. You see that with no images, the control group in our experiment, that group actually looks fairly similar to the experiments of quiet. That means when there was no noise, nothing happening. So it's actually a nice finding, because sometimes it's very hard to reproduce effects, especially these are experiments conducted in different labs, in different countries, actually, the data we collected in South America. So it seems that overall the task is very reliable in producing self-control if nothing else is happening. If people are choosing between 2 cents and 10 cents, several trials, people will go for the 10 cents consistently. We keep adding things, like adding water or adding maybe that intense noise, or in our case, the images, it seems that people tend to be indifferent. And indifferent in this context means just you're choosing here and there, not a particular preference. What the last experiment on the right shows is another experiment that we're actually getting ready to submit for publication, in which we tried point loss. And what point loss means is basically people are, again, choosing between the green and the blue button. Same story, same experiment. But out of nowhere, randomly, points are deducted from their account, from the points that they get. They are deducted under different probabilities. So that means 5 points were removed on 0.03 per second or a 0.05 per second. So that means more likely the point loss. So what you see here is some of the data that we have and we're preparing. I put there, kind of the reminder of if people are choosing more the LL, that means more self-control. If people are choosing less LL, that's more impulsive. And what you see is kind of a nice, not particularly, we wish it was more consistency, but there's a trend, at least with point loss, that the more points that are deducted, again, this is non-contingent, independent of what the participant is doing, there's an increase, but again, it's a tendency to indifference. That's the line that you see in the middle. So that seems to be the case. That seems to be the conclusion so far in terms of these experiments. Okay. So that's for humans. And so as I was doing these with humans, and there are different explanations as to why humans will prefer to explore, because that's basically what is happening. Participants are switching between LL and SS, between impulsive and self-control. So they're reducing their preference. That's what it means to be indifferent, which, again, think about it, they're losing a lot of cents. Still money. So it's interesting, but so we were trying to bring this to under a more controlled environment. So we moved into trying this with rats. So this second chapter is about doing something very similar. You're going to see the experiments somehow resemble those original experiments that I showed you with humans, now with rats. And this is the part that I said from humans to rodents. So one of the first set of experiments that
Oh, I do have a...
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Usha.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, and it was really interesting. I'm coming at it from my own perspective. I was just wondering, I was trying to relate these terms you've used, like impulsivity and self-control. How does impulsivity, is it, similar to how does it relate to things like inhibitory control?
That's a very good question, and I think that's the reason I started with the behavioral analysis background. So once you set your framework as a behavioral analyst, saying that what we study is behavior. So we're looking for actions. We're looking for what people do. We focus sometimes on what people don't do, which I think is typically what has been studied under the assumption of inhibition. But those experiments have a different approach and a different assumption. And I think for us, typically, even if people inhibit, and that means not responding, they are going to respond doing something else. And that's kind of the basic assumption here that I think is a little bit hard to accept, because what we're trying to do is to measure what people actually do. So when you give an option between, do you want 2 cents now, or you want 10 cents in 20 seconds or in 1 minute or in 10 minutes, because sometimes we make participants wait a lot. In a way, you may think that what participants are doing are inhibiting from choosing the 2 cents immediately. Regardless if that's how we see it or not, what we want to measure is what they actually chose to do, which is they chose to engage in the other option that is going to pay them off the 10 cents in 20 seconds or 1 hour or whatever it is. Now, some of the notions of impulsivity or impulsive choice, some of them tend to be more explanations of the behavior. So I think inhibitory control is typically a way to explain, is more like a construct of what people do or do not do or doesn't do. And of course, as a theoretical and conceptual framework, that's a different way to look at things, because that's basically trying to model what kind of cognitive or what kind of psychological processing is going on that explains that people may or may not act, may or may not choose amongst different options. That's a different framework, and I think it's very important that you're asking this, because I think the tradition for many psychological research on impulsivity has been focused on that, on the no action, on the no, on inhibiting or acting. From our perspective, again, as I try to explain, not acting is acting. Inhibiting, by definition, means doing something else. We're always interacting. So when we have someone, that happens actually very often, the participants just decide to pretty much don't do anything during our experiments. It actually does just give up. They just fail so often to find the images, that they just start doing something else. They start talking to themselves. They start looking at their phone. So in a way, they're choosing. They're still choosing. They're choosing not to engage with our task, and they're engaging in other responses, looking around. And we try to tackle those alternative responses, because at the end, they're also choice. Interestingly, those responses, I mean, when you think about it, if they don't work with our experiment, they're losing money. And that's actually very interesting, because many of the choices that participants decide to make during our experiments literally mean losing money, or losing points, or losing rewards, whatever we're giving them. Sometimes we play with risk, and we give them probabilities of gaining something like a lottery or things like that. Sometimes we play with probabilities of punishment. So I think concepts like those are typically related with no action, with no behavior, but I think most of them are related with how to explain. And that, I think, when people talk cognitive, or a mental process or a psychological process that explain why people choose one thing or the other. we don't engage in that approach. We actually try to understand behavior of choosing, how people choose, and we manipulate the environment to see if we can make them to choose more of something or choose less of something. I don't know if that helps, Usha, because I think it's very important. It's a very different approach.
Yeah, thank you.
So could you talk more about magnitude reward and how previous learning history can affect it? That's an entire research on its own. Yes, absolutely. The two parameters that are typically manipulated in research on choice and self-control and impulsive preference are magnitude and delay. So as you saw, I kept constant on the experiments that I described. The 2 cents and the 10 cents were constant. There was the same magnitude, the same amount of money or the same amount of points or whatever. There's a complete different scenario when you start manipulating not only the delay, which is what was manipulated, the two options between immediate 2 seconds and 20 seconds, let's call it immediate or sooner. So those two interact and actually, first, I don't think I have not even the capacity to summarize what has been done on it, but what I can say is that they interact. So you can change choice, which is what we're actually trying to do here. We try to move choice from one side to the other. We typically want people to be more self-control, isn't it? We want people to choose better. So one way to change or switch that preference is by manipulating a combination of magnitude and delay. And that's that's typically what is going to be called an indifference point. And imagine that for some people, and that's idiosyncratic, each individual, each rat, each person that has been studied, there are points in which different combinations of magnitude and delay work to change, or what is going to be called reverse the preference from being impulsive to self-control or being self-control to being impulsive. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out. What is that point in which people or animals, organisms in general, what kind of parameters we need to tweak in terms of the delay and the magnitude, but also other parameters, as for example, let's say what I call stressful, aversive, how they actually affect that switch between being self-control or being impulsive in terms of preference. So history with any kind of experience related with the magnitude, related with the delays, related with what happens during the delays, that's a very important aspect that has been studied. All that, as any other history, allows us to predict what is going to be switching that preference from one to the other. So that's so the models. There's a lot of math on this. I'm not showing any of that here, but there's a lot of models that try to actually combine those parameters, including the magnitude and the delay, and other parameters, sensitivity, and perhaps one day we can actually add something related with aversive events into these models that they try to see at which point, which different changes on those parameters, we can predict that a person will switch between preference for one or the other. Okay, so I think that kind of addresses both, because Robin was asking about the learning histories about this. And you're mentioning delay discounting, and I haven't touched on it because hopefully I will be able to get there. But delay discounting is another way to study the same thing that I was doing. What happens with delay discounting is that it is a more systematic manipulation of that parameter, the delay. So you see most of the experiments on delay discounting, what they do is they keep the magnitude of the reward constant, and then they start changing the delay, or they combine both. They manipulate both. But I will try to get there. But anyway, so let's see if I can show you a little bit of research with rats and what has been done. Okay, great, thank you. I mean, this is helpful. Okay, so one of the first experiments that I encountered when I was trying to trace what has been done with rats, similar to what I was trying to do with humans, was this experiment. Oh, sorry. This experiment that Reed, actually it's a little bit old now, but Reed was interested in trying to see if he could get a model of binge eating, like eating disorders, but one in terms of increasing the intake of food with aversive stimulation. And he was trying to do that by presenting, surprisingly, also intense noise to rats. Again, pretty similar to that experiment that I just talked about with Flora, with intense noise and people choosing between options of So this experiment was intense noise with rats. They seem to be disconnected, but they keep that, let's say they share, those two experiments share that idea that response independent, like things that are happening in the environment that the organisms are not controlling, organisms are not taking any action on those stimuli. So noise was playing on a random presentation, so the noise was coming back and forth randomly for the rats. And what Reed was trying to see was if rats responded more for food. Because again, the whole point was to show if this could be a model for kind of trying to see if rats will start eating more or more than necessary, to use a model of overeating. So what you see here are some data in terms of different sketches of reinforcement. I don't need to go into the details, but remember that sketches of reinforcement entail, maybe from your classes back in the day, sketches of reinforcement entail that animals respond, and for temporal-based sketches of reinforcement, they have to wait. They respond and then wait a certain amount of time until the reinforcer is available again. That's what we call a fixed interval schedule. So in those schedules in which the rat has to wait for the next reinforcer to be available, so the rat is doing a lot of things. As I was saying, we're thinking that animals are choosing all the time. We are choosing all the time. So the rats are choosing between keep pressing the lever to produce the reinforcer or doing something else, grooming, taking, looking around, being vigilant, if maybe a predator is coming out. So there's a choice between keep trying to get the food from the lever, that was pressing a lever to get the food, or doing something else. And the interesting finding from this experiment was that rats increased their responding. That means rats, in a way, chose to keep engaging with the lever more than doing other things. Whatever it wasn't measured what was the rats were doing, but rats just engaged more with the lever. And think about it from the perspective of a time-based delivery of a reinforcer. Whatever the rat is doing during the time that the reinforcer is not available is a waste, is not efficient, is not useful. So all those extra responses that you see on the curves, you see the curves higher or lower for the bottom. I'm going to explain why in the bottom. That means that the rats were responding in a way that was not efficient. And that was actually controlled by the intense noise that was happening back and forth and randomly. So that was the first experiment. It was a nice demonstration. It worked fairly decent for that experiment we read. By the way, we tried to replicate it with our rats with entire failure. We haven't been able to reproduce the same effect that Reed reported. We try with noise, we try with chalks instead of it's very interesting that we haven't been able to reproduce that effect again. So because that didn't work, we couldn't get any effect similar to what he did. So we moved into a more choice situation with rats. And what you see here, I try to kind of make the analog with the rats. So what you see here, you see a rat choosing between two levers, the analog of choosing between the green and the blue button. And the rats choose between, again, a lot of pellets. They don't get cheese, though they will love to get cheese, but they get pellets. Pellets are very sweet and full of milk. Actually, that's what we have been discovering with the pellets that they get for what we purchase to give them. And so one lever produces few pellets, another lever produces more pellets. Actually, it's 3 against 1. 3 to 1 pellets are delivered on these situations. Rats choose, and there's a delay from one and the other. Same story, same logic. So this experiment has a little bit of a background that I will try to explain here. And this actually relates to all this about the delay discounting situation. And what we were trying to do with this experiment was trying to show what is being called reversal of preference. And what happens is that's a very important concept, because what has been demonstrated, as you see in the graph on the right, is that depending on the timing and the distance, the temporal distance, the delay to the events, and how those delays and magnitudes, going back to the question that was made, you may see preference for self-control, or you may see preference for impulsive choice. And what you see in these curves, and this is based on the math behind all this, which is a hyperbolic adjustment model that actually fits very well these kind of situations of choice. What you see is when on the right, when you see the $7 and the $10, which are smaller and larger, when people are choosing far away, like with enough time in advance, they're going to show control preference. That's the TA time. And let me see if I can show that with the pointer. Give me 1 second. I think that will help. See, here, when the distance to the events is long, the delay is, the time to choose is long away, so preference for self-control typically happens. But as the moment of choice approaches one, then there's a moment in which there's a reversal, and then indifference comes, and preference for impulsive will come up. So you see here, preference for self-control. At some point, there is this reversal in which now preference for impulsive appears. And there are a lot of manipulations in terms of the timing of the events that take place, which is when the animals are going to choose, like the different durations or delays that are added to one option or the other, the magnitude that is added to one magnitude and other. But what all these, and this is replicated on and on with different species and different rewards, money, sex, points, and food, is that there's a point in which people reverse their preferences, and that's depending on the distances, those parameters, and that's a very interesting thing to identify. So we wanted to see, as I say in the introduction to this, we wanted to see if by adding an aversive context, these points of reversal will move further or higher. Okay, so, and that's basically what we're trying to do, because it's very well known and we wanted to know. And also we wanted to see if, same as with Flora and other researchers, we wanted to see if we could increase the probability of choice or of impulsive or self-controlled choice. So that was kind of a mixed purpose on this. So we had 16 rats. So rats were choosing between two levers, as I said. 8 rats went into no shocks. So just rats choosing between the 1 pellet and 3 pellets. And other rats were experiencing food shocks, mild, 0.25 milliamperes. For rats, I mean, of course, that has to be validated, and we did it, and it hasn't been validated, but it is an aversive stimulus that is not dramatically aversive. Rats will not squeal, rats will just not necessarily stop what they're doing, but you still see some kind of startle response in the rats with this. So we tried to mimic an aversive stimulus that was not that intense, similar to be, exposed to the noise, or similar to be putting your hand in cold water, which is not, dramatically unpleasant. So this is a kind of a summary of how the trials will go. So a rat will choose between SS and LL. Remember, SS is impulsive, LL is self-control. The rat will choose between SS. If it chooses SS, 2 pellets were given. Sorry, it was 2 pellets. I think it's 2 and 4. I forgot that we changed that at some point. So 2 pellets, and they will wait for the remaining of the trial, just sitting there and waiting for the trial to reset. So that's immediate, the impulsive option. The other option is choosing LL. There was initially a delay of 6 seconds. They will get in 4 pellets, and then they will wait for the remaining of the trial, and then the trial will be reset. And this is going for 30 trials, sometimes 60 or 90 trials. Sometimes we run longer experiments. Okay. So after we got a baseline on this, and we got a clear preference of rats doing this, and again, rats typically, same as humans, they will go into self-control. They will show typically a preference for self-control under these situations. They don't mind waiting the 6 seconds for the 4 pellets. Then what we try is to reverse that preference for self-control, and what we do is that we add delays to those 4 pellets. So we start checking each of the 16 rats. We start adding delays, So for the next session, we add 6 seconds, we add 9 seconds, we add 12 seconds to the LL option, whereas the SS option remains the same. Always 2 pellets immediately if the rat chooses to do so. And what we're trying to do is to assess when, again, the indifference point, when the rat switches preferences. Typically, rat starts with self-control, and as we add delays, at some point the rat says, screw it, I'm going to go for the impulsive option, and then they start preferring the impulsive option. So we can assess this for each one of the rats, and we do that for each one of the rats. Okay? So in a way, what we're doing is just pulling, I'm just trying to simulate it here a little bit, we're just pulling that larger reward further away while keeping the impulsive option in the same place, and we try to find a reversal, a preference for SS. So that's what we're trying to flip. Okay. And then we do another condition, which is try to get back the animals to prefer the self-control option. And we do that by adding delays to both options. So this is a little bit counterintuitive, but whereas in the previous condition, we added delays only to one of the options, the ideal self-control option, now what we're trying to do here is separate the moment of the decision, of the choice, from the events that are going to take place later, but the relationship between the 2 and the 4 pellets remains the same. The timing, the proportion is the same. We're just making the events further and further away, both of them. Both of the 2 pellets and 4 pellets are delayed. So in a way, what we're doing is actually, instead of only pulling the self-control, we're actually pulling, I mean, making them delayed consistently more and more and more and more. And this is what a rat typically will do. A rat, as we increase the delays of both options, rats reverse their preference. They start preferring the impulsive option, and as we keep delaying the 2 options, rats say, okay, if I have to wait for both, okay, let me just go back and start preferring the self-control option. I just want to highlight, and I know we're running out of time, but let me just highlight something about this, and it's just keep in mind that these are 25, 60. Some rats were actually waiting 90 seconds to get those 4 pellets. 90 seconds in a life of a rat is a long, long time. And the interesting thing about this is that now both the SS, the impulsive, and the self-control are delayed in time. And if you think about it, that's probably what happens with us. If we are asked in January if we are going to be committing to save money in June, if the decision is going to be made in June and we're going to be saving money, we're going to get interest and all that, most likely we're going to choose in a self-control way. And our decision will be different if we were choosing in May. Even if the distance between the two and the magnitude and the interest and everything will be different. So putting distance between the moment of the choice and the consequences, even if they still have differences in delays, may typically reverse preference for self-control. And that has been very well known. So that's what we did. So just some data. Okay, rats, very self-control, no differences between shock and no shock. That's what you see here. So it doesn't matter if rats were stressed or not. No particular change in their preference for self-control. That's what you see here. A lot of variability, but so I have some Spanish-speaking memes there. Yeah, because I speak in Spanish, so probably you got surprised. Now, when we started delaying the LL, trying to reverse to SS, remember, we're trying to make rats, again, more impulsive by delaying LL. Interestingly, what you see, again, a lot of variability. What you see, each one of these dots is one rat. So all these are the rats distributed throughout the different delays, several and several sessions and sessions and sessions. But what you see is as we increase the delay, rats that are experiencing shock, rats under stress, rats under pressure, actually resist to switch into the impulsive option. Basically, of course, this is a very small effect, and we still need to replicate these more. But basically, rats do not reverse to impulsive, or they take longer to reverse. And that was counterintuitive because, again, we assume that under stress, a rat should be more impulsive. But no, actually, they took longer or more sessions or more delays to finally cave in and say, okay, I'm moving into the impulsive option. So that's the reason the line actually is a little bit higher. And then when we try to reverse rats to self-control again, remember that's the last condition, we pull back the delays of both options. Again, rats under stress, those are the dark dots here, rats under stress actually reverse faster. They go back to self-control faster. Of course, a lot of variability, but interestingly, under stress or under adverse circumstances, rats reverse faster. They became self-control again quicker than rats without the shock. So that's what we see here. Okay, so I know that we are over time, so I'm gonna stop here. if there are questions or not. I think that was an issue that we started a little bit late. But anyway, so any questions right now? What would the lever relate to or represent in the rat's own natural environment? That's what Usha asked. That's a very good question. Um, it has been debated, and that's a very good question. Debated in terms of the ecological validity of these tasks, of these procedures. What has been said, and I think is acceptable, I think, is that these are sources of reinforcement, or they could be patches for, foraging. When we talk about how animals search for food and they have different options, or they have patches in which there's food or resources available with different probabilities or with different delays. So the levers, because they are delivering food at different probabilities, different delays, different magnitudes, they are said to be simulating in a way patches in a foraging situation. And there have been very interesting experiments in which they have actually tried to make it more realistic, like instead of having the two levers very close to each other, so animals actually have to travel to go to a different location and still go and do something and invest energy or responses. At the end of the day, behavior is energy spent, is risk. It is in a way to calculate how there is a trade-off between searching for food, which entails behavior, entails risk and energy, and what the outcome is to compensate for that in terms of foraging. So that's what has been typically said, Usha. But of course, there's not everybody is on board, and some behavioral ecologists think that these models are too simplified, and a more realistic scenario should be done. When it has been tried, by the way, the parameters hold. The models hold that it doesn't really matter. We do it with these very oversimplified, like the prediction when animals will switch between one preference or the other. It holds. So yeah, but I understand, and I think that's a very fair question. Thank you.
Well, just as a follow-up, the lever is always related to the food, right? But what if could you bring in another variable? Maybe these studies have been done where something bad will happen by pulling the lever for the food, and you get the food, but something bad happens to someone else, like a buddy.
Absolutely. So
I wonder whether rats, rats obviously they have buddies too, and
that's a great. I mean, you can imagine that punishment, because that's how I started this whole thing. See, all the experiments that I described, where when the shocks, which is the punishment, was totally unrelated, uncontrollable by the rats. Okay, I can see absolutely the progression, and that's where we're heading right now. We're actually trying to get approval to run one experiment in which pressing the lever will have different consequences, not only food and delays and all these, but also different probabilities of a negative outcome. In this case, being shocked, or as you're saying, there could be other negative outcomes. Like, for example, losing the food, like not always when we press a lever, the food comes, we wait for it and then it comes. Sometimes, even if there is a high likelihood that we're going to get our food delivered when we pay for it and we got an Uber Eats, sometimes it doesn't get to our place, and there's a risk. And that risk, I can see for sure that it can be modeled further for social interactions. I don't think that kind of interaction that you're proposing has been done, but I wouldn't be surprised that it has been attempted.
It's like,
social
pushing the lever then could cause harm to another rat. Although it would meet the need for food,
Which has been done with humans, by the way. Very interestingly, those are studies that mimic the same approach that we're talking, but humans are asked, okay, so different choices, but some of the choices are actually punishing someone that they know, someone that is socially or not related to them. That is being called social discounting. So they have been done with, but I don't know if they have been done with non-human animals. So that's a very great question. Yeah.
Just one, if I may, but just one related thing, and because in my own work with language, we deal with things that are innate. I guess it's inevitable, right? Like certain types of behavior, like when you look at language development, for example. So I was wondering, how I know that if this is coming from a behavioristic tradition, then how do you deal with instinct? You know, impulsivity and instinct. You know, there's something like language instinct, or you know, with different domains. You know, it's.
So I think it's a fair question. So, I mean, as I think I mentioned, but I think it's a very interesting question. It is, how do we add to this way of understanding behavior? How do we add the biological history? I think that's what I will call the instinct, or those responses that are more reflexive in nature, or that are more naturally controlled across all the individuals of the species, that are, let's say, predetermined by a biological history. Behavior analysts, we assume that that's kind of the foundation from which the idiosyncratic interactions are built upon. So the same way that we come inherently with certain tendencies that varies across individuals. You know, we have a different tendency to process lipids. You know, like, for example, I have a very bad issue with cholesterol. The same way we may have different sensitivities to reinforcement. And that has been studied. And in fact, one of the experiments that I'm actually planning to run soon is trying to control that history, maybe not going that way back into previous generations, but it can be done. So, you know, you can actually select rats for different genetic tendencies. It has been done for hyperactivity, has been done for preference for sugars. All that can be selected genetically as a predisposition, biological. I'm not going that back far, but I'm actually starting as soon as the animals are born, and we are actually changing the history of the animals at the biological level with a high level of stress. And we're trying to see if that very early adversity, we call it early stress. Actually, I'm just using the protocols that Dr. Hyland and his students are using. Those very early biological experiences, that they change dramatically the development of the brain. So we want to see how that down the road in adolescence of these rats changes the preference that we see. And actually, I think I don't know if you still can see my slides, so maybe I can just put it back again. But again, Usha, what I'm trying to see is we incorporate these biological tendencies, these biological responses, we incorporate them as the foundation from which interactions are developed later. So if I'm very sensitive to sugar because of my history or because whatever happened in my ancestors or in general, my sensitivity to respond to a delay consequence that entails sugar is going to be different. And that has been predicted and that has been changed. The interesting thing about it, that even in people with a very high tendency to not being able to wait, to you know, what is being called that difficulty to deal with the delays, that can be changed, and it can be changed with language. That's a very cool thing that I want to connect with what you're saying. At least in humans, what is being done is interventions that try to reverse preference for impulsive choices to self-control choices. Most of the interventions that work best are language-based interventions in which people start imagining themselves in the future. And they describe what is going to happen in the future, and that actually changes, importantly, preference. So, you know, for certain socially relevant changes, you know, like people that are susceptible to addiction and things like that, that's kind of the way to go, at least in terms of interventions, and that's what is being done. And it requires that kind of linguistic intervention. But it affects how the day-to-day choice changes, which I think is very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yep.